Good morning and welcome everyone to day 2 of the New Lines Institute's conference on gender and genocide in the 21st century. My name is Emily Prey and I'm a senior analyst here at New Lines, and I am delighted to introduce this conference and this panel on gender analysis of contemporary genocides. I am so excited to introduce the moderator, Grant Shubin, and the speakers, Sarita Ashraf, Evelina Ohab, Erin Farrell Rosenberg, and Razia Sultana. So without further ado, Grant, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you to the audience and to New Lines. And on behalf of the New Lines Institute, thank you so much for joining us today. Like Emily said, I'm Grant Shubin, the legal director of the Global Justice Center, an international human rights organization dedicated to advancing gender equality through the rule of law for women and girls all over the world. And I'm going to start today's event with just a bit of housekeeping. So in terms of our run of show, we'll first have a moderated question and answer session with our amazing panelists. And then after that, we will go into an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A box, which is down at the bottom of your screen. You can ask them anytime. And if you're targeting your question to a particular panelist or on a particular subject, please feel free to note that. And today's event, of course, is looking at a gender analysis of contemporary genocides. And we will hear from 4 incredible experts who we are extremely privileged to have with us. So first, on our panel, we have Razia Sultana. Razia is a lawyer, a teacher, and a human rights advocate. In 2019, she was awarded the US State Department's Women of Courage Award for her work in law and advocacy on behalf of the Rohingya in Rakhine State, Myanmar. A Rohingya herself, Razia has worked directly with the Rohingya community, particularly women and girls, since 2014. And in this work, she practices law, conducts research, and educational programs that specialize in trauma, mass rape, and human trafficking. She's interviewed hundreds of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and published 2 reports, Witness to Horror and Rape by Command, documenting the sexual violence by Myanmar's security forces against the Rohingya. In April 2018, she addressed the UN Security Council in its open debate on sexual violence and conflict, which shed light on the findings of these reports. And Razia finally is the coordinator of the Free Rohingya Coalition, a director of the Arakan Rohingya National Organization's Women's Section, and the founder of Rohingya Women Welfare. Also on the panel, we have Erin Rosenberg. Erin is an adjunct professor for the University of Cincinnati College of Law and an attorney specializing in international criminal law and reparations. She worked for a decade in international criminal law, first beginning at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia on the Ratko Mladic case, before moving to the International Criminal Court, where she worked in the appeals chamber and at the Trust Fund for Victims. She's the former senior advisor for the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she was the lead author of the report series, Practical Prevention, How the Genocide Convention's Obligation to Prevent Applies to Burma. She's a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of International Criminal Justice and the American Bar Association's Working Group on Crimes Against Humanity. Third, on the panel, we have Dr. Evelina Ohab. Dr. Ohab is a human rights advocate, author, and co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response. She works on the topic of genocide and persecution of minorities around the world. She's written over 30 reports to the UN and made oral and written submissions to the UN Human Rights Council and UN Forum on Minority Issues. She also authored the initiative and proposal to establish UN International Day commemorating victims and survivors of religious persecution, which culminated in the establishment of the UN Day commemorating victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief by the UN General Assembly. She holds a PhD in international law, medical law, and ethics. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Sarita Ashraf. Sarita Ashraf is a barrister specialized in international criminal law with expertise in the gendered commission and impact of international crimes, most notably genocide. She currently supports the work of the UN Investigative Mechanism to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh, UNITAD, and is a senior legal consultant to a number of projects focused on case building in relations to the crimes occurring in Iraq and Syria. From May 2012 to November 2016, she served as the chief legal analyst on the UN Commission of Inquiry for Syria. She's also served as a legal advisor and defense counsel at the International Criminal Court and the Special Court for Sierra Leone, respectively. She's a visiting fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. And I'm very proud to say she also authored GJC's report on gender and genocide titled Beyond Killing, which very much recommend everyone go and read. So before getting into the moderated questions, I just want to briefly frame our discussion. And as this whole event hosted by New Lines delves into, gender is expressed in the commission and response to genocide in various ways, including in the types of destructive acts that perpetrators choose, the means of destruction, what types of conditions are considered to constitute a risk of genocide, and what genocidal crimes are ultimately prosecuted. And that is, members of targeted groups, by the perpetrator's own design, experience genocide in distinct ways because of their gender. So an understanding of what it is to be male and female in a particular society saturates perpetrators' conception of their victims and of themselves. And no less infused with these gender assumptions and impositions of gendered power is how the international community responds to the risk of genocide and ultimately prosecutes genocide. So today we're going to be unpacking some of these issues and talking about how gender can help us better understand the commission and response to the crime by looking at 4 distinct contexts: the situation of the Uyghurs, the Yazidis, the Tigrayans, and the Rohingya. So very, very long intro by me, but turning first to Sarita. Sarita, one of the defining features of the Yazidi genocide was the highly structured manner in which ISIL categorized members of the Yazidi population for different manners of attack. So can you say a few words about the role that gender played in that categorization process?
Yes, thank you, Grant, and thank you, New Lines, for having me on today. I'm really excited to be part of this panel. As you said, gender and genocide is something that I've worked on for a while and continues to be very close to my heart, close to what I think is important that we, as we move forward and better understanding genocide. When it came to the Yazidi genocide, gender was intrinsic to the way in which the genocide planned and carried out. Throughout the Yazidi genocide, we saw that there was an architecture of crimes into which the Yazidis were placed, and violations that they suffered were largely determined by their gender, by their perceived gender, and by their age, as well as obviously the primary identifier, which was their ethno-religious identity as Yazidis, which is a group that ISIL holds to be pagans and drawing from prejudices long existent in Iraq and Middle Eastern society that they are devil worshippers, which is, of course, incorrect. What we saw, the Yazidi genocide, and I'm not going to go into the details of the genocide because I'm sure there's enough out there that for people that don't know to read it, but we see very much, largely killing crimes, some forced labor being directed towards men and adolescent boys. Women and girls over 9 are actually subjected to a wide range of violence, including but not limited to sexual violence, but also other forms of more gendered forms of forced labor and torture. And then, of course, for younger boys, we see child soldiering, which in itself is a crime, but also contains within it a multitude of other associated crimes. One of the reasons that gender became such a conversation around ISIL's attack on the Yazidis has been because that the attack wasn't accompanied by large-scale mass killings. That doesn't mean there weren't killings. There were certainly, in some cases, the men of entire villages, such as Kota village, were wiped out and executed in mass graves that have now only just been excavated and their remains, some of the remains identified. But also the lack of kind of widespread mass killing in the manner of, for example, Rwanda or Srebrenica made it easier to have the conversation around, well, how do we understand this genocide in the absence of mass killing? How do we understand these series of crimes which clearly go towards the intent to destroy the group, about which ISIL was extremely open? It allowed us to have that conversation. ISIL is pretty unusual as well in terms of genocidal actors, in that it doesn't attempt to reframe or mitigate what it's trying to do, because it believes that what it is doing is correct as part of purifying the society that they're in. They don't intend to be they didn't intend to be part of the international community of nations. So there was no sugarcoating it, which meant that the question of intent, which is so difficult normally for those of us to look at genocide to infer from various evidence, that hurdle was in some ways largely removed by ISIL's very clear and public projection of what it was trying to achieve. This also meant it allowed us not only to direct our attention from the genocidal, the acts of genocide, but also to the question of intent. Because even where we've seen, for example, in Rwanda, acts of, for example, sexual violence, which were then linked to genocide, it always took place in the context of mass killings, and therefore where we could draw from the intent to physically destroy. The Yazidi genocide also forced us to grapple with what it meant to intend to biologically destroy the group, which is something that there isn't as much jurisprudence on, and that we still continue, as I'm sure other panelists speaking about other situations will say, we still struggle to understand how intent to biologically destroy is evidenced and is reacted to in terms of our response. I'd say just two final things is this, that ISIL's world is really best understood as the worst parts of the human character, but on steroids. So we see within the kind of rubric of ISIL, not only these horrific attacks, for example, on marginalized groups in the community, ethno-religious groups, of course, but also members of the LGBT community. And of course, their attacks on women, which range beyond the Yazidis, but the Yazidis with sexual enslavement of women, the complete objectivization, treating them as chattel, and selling them in markets, and obviously treating them without any sense of human dignity or value, is something that is one of the most, the deepest forms of misogyny. And so when people say that, but it exists in all societies, so that when people say, well, how could people come from, for example, Europe into this thing and treat all these people, including, have female slaves, in some ways the misogyny of ISIL is shocking, but it is drawn up from the same well as the misogyny we see in ordinary society. And the final thing I want to say is that, as you alluded to in your introduction, Grant, is that when we speak about the role of gender played in the process, there is this push to looking at it in terms of what the perpetrators did, how we understand what the perpetrators did. But gender, as I'll speak, hopefully we'll speak about later on, is also intrinsic to how we react to genocide, how we understand genocide, and the steps that the international community or the UN Security Council, for example, will take in addressing genocide. So when we speak about the role of gender playing the process, we'll hopefully speak a little bit more about that later in terms of what our own gendered understandings mean about our ability and sometimes willingness to recognize genocide as it's occurring.
Thank you for that, Sarita. Such insightful perspectives, and agreed that one of the most interesting things I think that can come out of a conversation on the interlinkages or the ways that gender can help us better understand genocide is precisely in how we react to it. So hopefully, I agree, later on we can get into a more robust conversation on how these gendered understandings, on how certain crimes evince themselves with a gendered understanding can help the international community better respond, which actually segues very nicely into a question that I had for Aaron. And so one of the commonalities between the Yazidi genocide and the situation with respect to the Uyghurs is a very discrete separation of the sexes and the highly gendered subsequent crimes against cisgendered women. And so I'm hoping that you can share perspectives on the way that gender is a central feature in the way that the Chinese Communist Party has operationalized its atrocities against the Uyghurs. And Aaron, if I wasn't clear, I was directing that to you.
Thank you for that question, Grant. And you're exactly right that gender is really intrinsic and central in the manner in which the Communist Party is carrying out crimes against the Uyghur people. However, I do want to start by simply highlighting for the audience, for those who are not necessarily familiar with the Uyghur situation, that the persecution of the Uyghurs as a group has many components, and it is truly in terms of a campaign of persecution, all encompassing, affecting all aspects in profound ways of the daily lives of the Uyghur people as a whole. And while there are, and I'm going to discuss some of the gendered aspects, I do also want to highlight that there is a fair amount of crossover. And so the distinctions for example, certain types of acts which are directed more at women or features that are associated with the female gender also do affect men, though to a lesser degree. There are, in terms of what China is doing in terms of persecuting the Uyghurs, I also want to point out that there are multiple policies or campaigns and that these function together. So when we talk about how crimes and harms are being perpetrated, they need to be viewed holistically and not in isolation. They work together to create a truly oppressive overall environment for the Uyghur people. One of the most well-known policies is known as the Strike Hard campaign, beginning in 2014. And the key aspect of this campaign is what's known as re-education. So this is where the Chinese Communist Party viewed the Uyghur people as a whole as being extremist and a threat to national security in terms of their way of life and their manner of interaction with China. And so they put in place a very intense, and this is a, in terms of, it really matches its name, right? Strike hard. This is a very, very intense program of the mass detention of Uyghur people. Now, in terms of looking at the detention, it's first important to understand that this is a pre-crime detention, meaning that it is based on a determination of suspicion, not of having actually committed a crime. And so here already we can see how gender plays out. Data has been presented of why various Uyghurs were detained. And what we see is that the single largest reason why women are deemed suspicious is because of violations of the birth limits, which have been imposed in Xinjiang region, as well as a refusal or hesitancy to comply with the birth control measures. So meaning to be sterilized, to have IUDs inserted. For men, the reasons why they are deemed suspicious are much more varied and tend to focus more on religious practice, signs of religious devotion. Another aspect of this program, and I think this is something that is sometimes not necessarily fully understood, is that there is the detention program, and then there's also the imprisonment of Uyghurs. And this is a separate campaign, which tends to, in terms of who is being targeted for very lengthy prison systems, focus mainly on male religious and cultural leaders. Again, I do want to stress that doesn't mean that women are not being pulled into this. They are. Now, when we look at the treatment in the detention centers, we again start to see different ways in which the treatment of the Uyghurs plays out in terms of gender. Women have reported, and this has been well documented, that within the detention camps, in terms of the gendered forms of torture and abuse that they face, this includes rape, sexual assault, and forced sterilization. And again, men are also subject to this. However, the male detainees to a lesser degree, and the forced labor aspect of the detention camps is more male focused. And the final point, and I'm going to get more into this in a later question, and I know this is just the first question, so I don't want to take too much time, but I will be speaking more about what's known as the population optimization policy. And this policy needs to be distinguished from the Strike Hard campaign. It is a much longer, long-term policy that China is putting in place to change the demographic makeup of Xinjiang. And there are just 2 points that I want to make about this policy. One is that in terms of the out-migration aspect, meaning the removal of Uyghurs from Xinjiang region to other parts of China, impacts both men and women. However, China has targeted programs within the rural population transfer program specific to women, targeting women who stay at home, who are primarily caregivers. And this is where you may be familiar with the information about children being placed in care homes, the elderly being placed in care homes. And this is centralized care homes. And this is related to the role that rural women play and is meant to essentially remove those aspects of their life and their experience in order to coercively and forcibly transfer them. And of course, the last, which I will speak about in response to some of the later questions and hopefully with the panelists, is of course the population optimization policy has as an explicit component the reduction of the size of the Uyghur population, which is carried out almost exclusively in terms of the targeting of Uyghur women for sterilization and other birth prevention measures. Men have been sterilized mainly in the context of within the camps, but the policy optimization program is distinct from that. This is a mass sterilization program which is being carried out administratively, bureaucratically, and not within the camp and detention setting. So it is in addition to that. And I think with those remarks, we can already start to see one, the sort of vast degree of criminality, of harm that's being caused in so many different ways, but also how gender really plays a role in terms of how these acts affect the Uyghur population. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Erin. And without hopefully not putting words in your mouth, but I think that some of the subtext of your comments is that, you know, a gendered look at genocide isn't a look at what's happening to women, or isn't a look at only sexual violence. A gendered look at genocide helps understand, looking strictly at the commission, the ways that perpetrators use gender as a mode of power to target those who are seen to have a preponderance of power, or to target the ways that certain members of the group relate to the reproductive capacity of that group, or the certain cultural aspects of that group. So extremely insightful, and I think cutting the fact that religious leaders tend to be male, tend to be targeted for a particular type of treatment, whereas rural women who are seen to have a certain responsibility are targeted for a different type of treatment. And I think understanding that and understanding the dynamics of that really helps create a fuller understanding, a more fulsome understanding of the ways that genocide is perpetrated with these gender infusions of power. So, again, somewhat related to that, Evelina, I would like to turn to you on the situation of ongoing violence in Tigray, which the violence in Tigray has components both of sexual violence, but also distinctly of reproductive violence. And so with respect to the crimes against Tigrayan cisgender women, I'm hoping you can share with us how sexual violence differs from reproductive violence, and how both might be indicia of genocidal intent.
Thank you very much, Grant. And indeed, in the case of Tigray, we see both. And indeed, rape and sexual violence can and often are both. If we look at the act itself, but also if we look at the impact upon the victim. So rape and sexual violence can be classified as Article 2B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, and Article 2D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And indeed, that's what we are seeing in the case of Tigray. For example, let's take the new Amnesty International report published only a few weeks ago. It clearly shows the severity and nature of the atrocities of the sexual violence in the context of the conflict, which has been accompanied by shocking levels of brutality, including beatings, death threats, and ethnic slurs. It is often accompanied by threats and additional acts of physical, psychological torture aimed at causing lasting fear and physical and psychological damage. So, of course, if we look at the descriptions provided by Amnesty International, we would straight away think about this rape and sexual violence as causing serious bodily or mental harm, but ultimately, again, we need to think about the impact of the atrocities upon women, and we know, of course, that in many cases women would not want to have children in the future because of everything that they've been through. But also we've seen evidence of atrocities that ultimately will result in women not being able to have children in the future. And I will mention a few of the examples in a moment. And also in the Amnesty International report, we've seen some very horrifying testimonies of women who were subjected to rape and sexual violence. For example, one woman testified that and I'm just using her words, they raped me one after the other. I don't know if they realized I was pregnant. I don't know if they realized I was a person. And some of the abused women and girls were also held in sexual slavery for several weeks. And as Amnesty International also said, that the patterns of sexual violence emerging from survivors' accounts include that the violations have been part of a strategy to terrorize, degrade, and humiliate both the victims and the ethnic group. And earlier this year, also, we've seen a lot of reports from Lucy Casa, a journalist who has been reporting on the situation in Tigray from the beginning of the conflict. And she obtained, again, a horrific testimony from a victim of rape who said that she was told by one of the people who raped her that our problem is with your womb. Your womb gives birth to Wayane, which is a derogatory term used to refer to TPLF. A Tigrayan womb should never give birth. And this is precisely what a survivor of the atrocities was told when she was gang raped and mutilated afterwards. And of course, hers is just one of many similar reports emerging daily from Tigray. And this again suggests that rape and sexual violence against Tigrayan women is a weapon of war, is some means of harm, hurts women, but also it has, there are suggestions that it has also some kind of, it's a means to prevent births within the group in the future, and especially the last testimony recorded by Lucy Casa, I think, is very clear in relation to that. And in Ethiopia, of course, the use of rape and sexual violence against Tigrayan women may be considered to be a genocidal method to bring about the destruction of the community. They reportedly, of course, the perpetrators rape and gang rape the women and then subsequently mutilate, having told their victims that a Tigrayan womb should never give birth. But of course, especially today in this panel, we've heard about the atrocities against the Yazidis as perpetrated by Daesh, and the situation in Xinjiang, and of course the situation of Uyghur women, and we'll hear also about the situation of the Rohingya women. But I think just wanted to emphasize that at this stage, the atrocities perpetrated against the Tigrayan women are still relatively new. We are only approaching the first year of the conflict. So of course, we are at a different stage in terms of evidence collection. We are still just hearing some stories from the region. We are still far from having a comprehensive picture of the level of the atrocities, or how many, or even being able to assess how many victims of rape and sexual violence are out there. And of course, the atrocities followed the beginning of the conflict that was in November last year. And very shortly afterwards, in January 2021, we started hearing from the UN about the atrocities and allegations of sexual violence, including a high number of alleged rapes in the capital, Mekelle. But what we've been hearing as well, again, also in approximately January 2021, was also that some women have been reportedly forced by military elements to have sex in exchange for basic commodities, while medical centers have been reporting an increase in the demand for emergency contraceptions and testing for sexually transmitted infections, which is often an indicator of sexual violence in conflict. And in addition, there are also reports of sexual violence against women and girls in a number of refugee camps. So again, these are just reports being brought to light, but I do believe that it's only a tip of an iceberg of what we are going to to hear in the future, and especially once proper investigations are done, once the process of evidence collection begins. And on that note, I think we are also at a stage that we need to start collecting and preserving the evidence of the atrocities, hopefully for future prosecutions. But unfortunately, of course, at this stage, while some actors are monitoring the situation, collecting some information, this evidence is still not being collected in a way that would help with, for example, future prosecutions. And of course, Sareta mentioned that she's been doing incredible work with UNITAD and the investigative team that collects, preserves the evidence of the Daesh atrocities. And ideally, for the atrocities in Tigray, we would have a similar mechanism that would collect and preserve the evidence as soon as possible, of course, because with time, the evidence of the atrocities will disappear, will be destroyed. So the sooner the better, and we'll then have a proper and better understanding of what is happening to Tigrayan women in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that last part of your intervention regarding it being very early on touches on the very real need that Sarita explained a little bit further, that a gendered understanding of the ways that genocide is perpetrated can very much help at this stage, understand the risk of genocide, help us better identify when an emerging genocide is happening or is likely to happen. I think that the situation as you articulated is a perfect example of that. So going from an emerging genocide or in the very least a relatively recent onset of crisis to the situation in Myanmar where the Rohingya have been oppressed for far longer. Razi, I'd like to turn to you. The atrocities committed by the Tatmadaw during the 2016-2017 so-called clearance operations was highly systematic in the sense that very, very similar patterns of attacks occurred across many, many different Rohingya villages. So I'm hoping that you can share a few words about how each of these villages that the military, let me rephrase. I'm hoping that you can share commentary on how in each of these villages, the military used types of violence against different parts of the Rohingya population. For instance, how the military in each village across much of Rakhine State targeted violence against Rohingya men versus Rohingya women. Thank you.
Thank you, and hello everybody. I'm Razia Sultana, and myself is a Rohingya, and I born in Myanmar but brought up in Bangladesh, and I'm a founder of RW Welfare Society, which is working for prevent human trafficking and build psychosocial resilience among refugee women. Since 2016. I have interviewed hundreds of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and with the Rohingya news agency, Kaladan Press Network, I have published 2 reports, Witness to Horror in 2016 and Rape by Command in 2017. It shows a systematic sexual violence by Myanmar security force. It is already, we see the 4 years, and Myanmar launched their deadly operation in northern Rakhine State, killing thousands of civilians, burning 100 of villages, and driving over more than 700,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh. The scale and horror of the atrocity committed by the Myanmar troops has been exposed again and again in media and documented by international agencies. There is strong evidence that the operation was pre-planned and constituted genocide, as declared recently, not recently, it's already exposed by fact-finding mission. Among this atrocity, widespread sexual violence, and in my report, Rape by Command, detailed the rape of over 300 women and girls around August in 2017, and this is likely represents only a fraction of the total number raped at that time. And my report shows clearly the systematic use of rape by the Myanmar army as a weapon against the Rohingya. It shows that rape was committed on a widespread scale by hundreds of troops in villages across Mangdu and northern Butidong. Women were detained in military camps for rape, which was clearly authorized by the camp commanders. Most of the cases were gang rape, often in front of other troops or civilians, meaning that the soldier had no fear of witness because they were completely confident of impunity. In Tulatuli village in northern Mangdu, after hundreds of villagers had been killed in the morning, over 100 women and girls were rounded up and taken group by group to be gang raped over a period of hours, after which they were burned alive. The methodical way this gang rape was carried out by hundreds of troops indicate that rape was ordered as a part of the attack on this village. There was flagrant rape of very young girls. Many rape victims were tortured, mutilated, and killed. This shows that rape was not about the individual soldier wanting sexual enjoyment. They were authorized and ordered to rape in order to torture, harm, and kill Rohingya women. The mutilation of breasts and genitals seems deliberately aimed to destroy the very means of reproduction of Rohingya. This pattern of systematic rape by Myanmar security force are not new, and we know recently the Myanmar is taken over by the military, and it's not stopping anything. And our other ethnic sisters and women are also facing this same thing, and we know this pattern is same as past and this present. As we know, in the 2002, Shan Group released a report is named License to Rape, documenting sexual violence by the Myanmar army against 625 women and girls in Shan state, with the same pattern of gang rape, killing, and mutilation, and complete impunity. In 2014, the Women League of Burma released a report, same impunity and same pattern, documenting rape of over 100 ethnic women by Myanmar army troops. This showed how even after democratic election in 2010, the Myanmar army was continuing to rape ethnic women with impunity as a part of ongoing offensive in northern Myanmar, which have displaced over more than 200,000 people in past 10 years. Thus, the Myanmar army, the latest, not latest, but it's on almost 4 years against the Rohingya. It's not seen. It's not a simple thing, and we know this is genocide, and whatever we are on in ICJ and also ICC is over there, but we didn't see anything change because everyone is witness about Myanmar situation, and continuously they are doing their atrocity against their citizens, and the international community is still they are not taking any action, and especially the women. The most of the women, they are only the target because they know the women's issue is very sensitive, and as my experience, the Rohingya community is very conservative, and when it goes to the women, and all society is like a broken down, so this is a very easy target for them. So always we see the women are always in target, and target, and we are not analyze the women's why women always target in any influx or anything happened. There is no specific law or international effort to stop this kind of thing, and we know in the whole world there are so many things happening, and we know the women are only facing the harassment and the sexual violence this kind of sexual violence broken our confidence also when we every day we are seeing this kind of attitude and this kind of attack, and it's like we are in 21st century, but even we cannot change the women's situation. And I don't want to say more because we have to know more about other experienced members. So thank you. I'm very grateful to giving me a chance to say something about my community. Thank you.
Thank you, Razia. Such important work that you've done your whole life. So very much appreciate it. In particular, I think a lot can be, in terms of a gendered understanding of the crimes, so much can be reflected on, like you said, that the very clear in the patterns that the Tatmadaw used in its attacks against the Rohingya, that it was planned and systemized by the highest levels of the military, that they intentionally use sexual violence as a weapon as part of their atrocities and perpetration of crimes against the Rohingya. So, maybe shifting a little bit of the conversation from perpetration to other elements, including prevention of genocide and the onset of genocide, understanding genocidal intent. Sarita, I would like to take it back to you. One of the most, President Obama very publicly announced an operation to prevent genocide with respect to a military operation to rescue the Yazidis that had been trapped on Sinjar Mountain in the days following ISIL's initial siege of the region. But the frame of genocide really stopped there. And so my question to you is it gender discrimination to not articulate a risk of genocide, or much less an ongoing genocide, against Yazidi women and girls who were subsequently enslaved by ISIL throughout the course of what we know now was a genocide? So in other words, to only use the frame on the rescue operations while a genocide very much was planned and evident thereafter, is that gender discrimination?
Yes, thanks, Grant. So just taking us back to the statement by President Obama as the path to answering that question. On the 7th, the attack on the Yazidis started in the early hours of the 3rd of August 2014. The Obama White House released its statement on the 7th of August 2014, so very early days in terms of understanding what was happening on the ground. That the Obama White House was able to release the statement really speaks to some incredible and urgent work that the Yazidi community in the States did to bring it to the White House and the State Department's attention. And also, in my view, the role of having Samantha Power as one of his ambassadors in their understanding and passing around the language of genocide. In the statement itself, it does mention the enslavement, and I can put it into the chat, the link if people are interested in kind of how it was put out, because it was quite unusual to come out, because the US is usually pretty reticent about using the word genocide at all. And this was clearly a statement which went to the US's commitment to fulfilling its duty to prevent genocide by acting, the statement itself speaking then about the Sinjar Mountain and referring to the need to avoid a potential massacre has indicated, we can act carefully and responsibly to prevent a potential act of genocide. That's what we are doing on that mountain. And just for those who don't know, the Yazidis were attacked on the lower ground, but many of them fled to Sinjar Mountain, which forms the heart of the region, where they were then encircled by ISIS and besieged for several days, from at least for the 4th of August until the 10th, 14th of August. The US authorized airstrikes and also humanitarian aid to be flown into the mountain, which allowed them enough time to sort out the Syrian Kurdish forces coming in from Syria and opening up a corridor to take some of the Yazidis out. Hundreds of Yazidis died on the mountain, mainly due to dehydration, bearing in mind they were at the top of an arid mountain in the August Iraqi sun. Most of those were children. One estimate, non-demographic studies suggested that 93% of them were children. So when we're speaking about the issue of that statement and the duty to prevent genocide and the articulation of what genocide was, again, it was very much focused on the mountain of Sinjar. It was focused very much on killings, although there's a reference to women being enslaved on lower ground, that women are being taken away. We know that was something that was being articulated to the Americans, to others, to other states as well, but there was no action taken. Part of that is that it was just very difficult to take action. The mountain was a particularly relatively simpler to try and get people off of than to deal with people who were on lower ground and completely encircled by ISIL. But there was no action ever taken when it came to the women and girls and younger boys who were then captured and forcibly transferred deeper into the so-called caliphate. One of the challenges is that when we see what happened to the women and girls, that we see the struggle of trying to articulate genocide through non-killing. So yes, the statement mentions the enslavement of women and girls. It doesn't necessarily, I think, as I read it, link them into kind of a genocidal act, right? The genocidal act, the discussion of genocide is very much related to the potential death of these thousands of people, thousands of Yazidis on top of the mountain, which of course, you know, an important aspect, important fact that the US and the Iraqis and the Syrian Kurds went in and were able to rescue many of these people. But what we then saw is that not only was there inaction in relation to women, girls, and younger boys who were then taken to the caliphate, but they were gradually kind of removed from the discussion of genocide very early on, and then had to be kind of placed back into it when we got into 2015 and 2016 through the work of the US Holocaust Museum report, the UN Syria Commission's report. So not only were they cut from the kind of continuum of genocide, kind of carved off into a crimes against humanity space, not really understanding how ISIL's strategy was coordinated towards the destruction of the group in very different ways, beyond simply the killing of men and boys, and sometimes the mass killing of men and boys in some areas. The other thing that we notice is that when we speak about women and girls, and for those of you that know about the Yazidi genocide, that probably the one thing that you're very clear on is that women were sexually enslaved. And some of that was put in quite tawdry ways in media, referring to sex slaves, which is not a term that the Yazidis used, and I think which is a very provocative and slightly provocative term. And that's one of the reasons is that the crimes against women really honed in on this idea of the sale and sexual abuse of women, and to a lesser extent of girls over 9. So it became a very reductive understanding anyway of what happened to women and girls, and very packaged very kind of neatly as this kind of quite horrific thing that was somehow very appealing to audiences to read about. Aside from that, it also became very adult-centric. So not only did we see kind of crimes against women being taken away, segmented, their genocide, not discussed in the rubric of how does the intent to destroy relate to what they are doing to women, but also then women being reduced down to one of many crimes the women suffered. Again, not understanding necessarily how the reduction of human beings, of women, to objects to be bought and sold and traded, gift and willed, linked to genocidal intent, but also became very adult-centric. So even from within the community of women, of females who were suffering these crimes, younger girls, teenage girls began to fall out of the analysis altogether. So yes, when I think about it, the question is, was it gender discrimination not to articulate the risk of genocide or the ongoing genocide against the Yazidis who were subsequently enslaved by ISIS? Yes, I think one of the issues is that the unnuanced understanding of analysis of gender, an understanding of genocide, which is by itself gendered, but as masculinist, ignores the how genocide affects kind of women and girls, children on the whole, men who are not subjected to non-killing crimes, that it denies, we then don't recognize the crime against them. They're not included in the gamut of victims. They're not then included in discussions of how we respond to genocide, how we are fulfilling our duty to prevent. And beyond that, potentially our duty to punish genocide, how we are investigating, analyzing, and indicting the crime of genocide if we don't recognize a tremendous population of victims of the crime. So in that way, they're denied their right to equal protection. There is more written about the duty to punish genocide, and that comes largely out of some of the analysis of the ICTR, the Rwanda Tribunal's jurisprudence. But even then, there still continue to be failures now in understanding how to prosecute, investigate and prosecute crimes of genocide that don't affect adult males. But where we've really fallen apart, I think, is how do we abide by, how do we enforce the duty to prevent genocide, which is binding on all nations when it comes to women and girls in particular, as amongst other marginalized groups.
Thank you, Sarita. And yeah, again, I think a subtext maybe to your points is that, you know, and I think we touched on this with Aaron's comments, was that, you know, a gendered understanding of genocide is not just over there, that it's a central feature of understanding this crime in its wholeness. And so you know, the point is so well taken that by having a genocide frame only with respect to the you know, the operations on the mountain, the erasure, you know, that is subsequent to only defining certain acts or certain things that are familiar to us as genocide, how that causes an erasure of people's experiences. And, you know, I'll note that primarily in this event, and what all happens all too often is when we talk about gender, we talk only about cisgender women's experiences and only as victims. And Mia Bloom, I see your comment in the question and answer, which I hope we'll get to later, but particularly relating to the genocide against the Yazidis. There was a role for women to play as perpetrators as well, not of course Yazidi women, but well, Sarita, I'll let you answer. Putting you on notice, I'm going to ask you about that.
I would just say just a final comment that, you know, gender is intrinsic to genocide. So if you are not pursuing a gendered understanding and questioning the assumptions about gender that you're bringing to your analysis of this crime, then you are not really recognizing what genocide is, and not understanding the information that is before you that you're attempting to grapple with. So yes.
Couldn't agree more. I would have liked if that was your final comment rather than the comment with 40 minutes, but
Yeah.
only poking fun. But I mean, I think that that very much captures the importance of this event, generally of these 2 days that New Lines has put together, and really the need and the call to action for the international community and for scholars to more fulsomely understand this crime. So Aaron, I think, you know, touching on that, I'd like to ask you about maybe expanding our scope of the understanding of the destructive element of genocide. And, you know, traditionally, more often than not, when we think about group destruction for genocide, in whole or in part, we think about physical destruction. We think about killing fields and high numbers of people who are murdered. And for the most part, historically, we're talking about men and boys in that context. But that is not the only mode of destruction covered by international law on genocide. So in what ways does the treatment of the Uyghurs evince a biological intent to destroy the group, and how can we better understand the crime through those acts, or through that intent in the Uyghur context?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And maybe to pick up on something that you know, Sarita mentioned in her first comment, and then again, when we're talking about the underlying acts, right? We already see an overfocus on the first act of killing, and an overemphasis in terms of what constitutes as an act genocide, and a sort of hierarchy that many people seem to build in. We see this same sort of incorrect hierarchy that is mirrored in some ways, right, with the overemphasis of killing when we're talking about intent to destroy, in the sense that there is an overemphasis and an immediate look at physical destruction, whereas biological destruction tends to be more often, I would say, challenged and not recognized as being equal to physical destruction. So I just wanted to highlight that this sort of male-centric I would consider male-centric view works on both sides, right, of our two elements of genocide, both the actus reus and the mens rea. The issue of intent has been, in terms of the Uyghur situation, one of the most thorny and difficult issues that has been debated as to whether or not there are sufficient indicators to find genocidal intent. And I would suggest that this is mainly because the conversation began focusing on the components of the Strike Hard campaign. And focusing on trying to identify the intent related to the mass detentions and forced labor and mistreatment, torture, and abuse within the detention framework. This approach in view led to analyzing intent mainly from a physical destruction perspective. However, in 2021, we started to see new information coming out related to the sterilization, IUD, and other birth control measures being put in place in Xinjiang. Now, the first report that came out was more analytical of just looking at what was happening with the population growth, how many Uyghurs were being affected by this. But it left open this question, right, is why is China launching this mass sterilization and birth control program in Xinjiang? And so a lot of people challenged, in terms of biological destruction, that was really the intent of this because of China's long history of interference with the reproductive rights of Chinese women across the board, right? So the second report, and this is to me the more critical report, is the report that Dr. Adrian Zenz put out in mid-2021 about the population optimization policy, and I made reference to this before, which has three main components, right? It is the in-Han migration, the out-Uyghur migration, mainly through forced labor, and the last is an actual reduction in the size of the Uyghur population. Now, the overall goal of the population optimization policy is to change the demographics of Xinjiang, to make it less Uyghur and to increase the Han relative share of the population. Now, it's worth saying in terms of thinking about intent, right? Why? Why is this? And what the population optimization report shows us from the writings of Chinese government officials and academics is that it is based on the premise, and I really want to stress this to understand how this relates to the Uyghur people as a whole. It is based on the premise that as an ethnic group, the Uyghur people are, one, deemed of a lower quality inherently, and second, represent merely by their existence at the size that they are, a latent threat to the state of China. So this is, I think, in terms of just thinking about genocidal intent already, this is the frame we need to understand, right? Is that the Uyghur people are viewed as a threat as such by their existence and by their size. So how does China then choose to go about reducing the size of the Uyghur group, destroying in part the Uyghur group in order to, in its view, mitigate this national security risk? It does that by targeting the reproductive capacity of Uyghur women. And that is the third key component to the population optimization scheme, and is what distinguishes, in terms of genocidal intent, the biological destruction of the Uyghur group from other birth control programs in China that target other groups. And so I think when we understand from a biological destruction that this is not about, as we've heard from so many of our speakers, the physical destruction necessarily of the Uyghur group, nor is it about an immediate destruction. This is a long-term policy that is aimed at reducing the size of the population by targeting Uyghur women and destroying their reproductive capacity. And it is within, again, I want to stress this frame of that the Uyghur population is a threat by their very Uyghurness. And maybe if I could just say as a very final comment, because I think it's something that Sarita highlighted that I think is just so very important, is this issue of response and recognition. The role of sterilization and other birth control measures has been recognized by several governments as a genocidal act and is the basis for finding that genocide is occurring. However, we are also seeing in the debate what I think is very problematic, and which I would like to just sort of put on the table as something that needs to be responded to, is that for those who question whether or not it is a genocide, we are seeing the sterilization program being put almost in direct conflict with other acts of genocide, with this argument, and I will say exactly what has been said to me on several occasions, it's just birth control. And this type of diminishing and sort of reductive response to the horrors and seriousness of what these measures are intended to accomplish, but also the effect that they have on Uyghur women is something I find very, very problematic. So I don't mean to end on a sort of down note, but I think that we need to understand that biological destruction is equal and on par with physical destruction, and that prevention of births, as other speakers have mentioned, is not less than in any way any other act of genocide.
Thank you, Erin, and I think an incredibly astute point to end on, and there's so much to touch on there. So I reluctantly just go on to my next question, but I really think that you, like you say, the intent to biologically destroy has been such a topic of conversation, and I very much appreciate the packaging, and I very much. Again, I think a subtext of your commentary was because there is this blind spot to gender, the expression of gender power through destructive acts, that it can be even considered just birth control. I mean, that's absolute nonsense when you think of the broader context of the attacks as they're occurring, and you think about the social role that Han Chinese see Uyghur women fulfilling and their responsibility for the regeneration of the group. And so what types of harm, what types of attacks do you target them for? I mean, an extremely full spectrum of understanding of genocide, or in the very least, a risk of genocide in that analysis. And so I think that you really touch on an important part of the blind spots that come along with an overly male-centric view of the perpetration of genocide. So incredibly insightful. Thank you for those comments. I want to stay on this theme on blind spot. Evelina, turning to you. You touched on your comments earlier on the shocking accounts of violence, of sexual and reproductive violence occurring in Tigray. But for the most part, I think the lens of genocide is not one that has really yet been applied to Tigray, in the very least not regularly. And you in your comments earlier, you highlighted the fact that it's still very early days. But I think that the lack of a genocidal frame in the context is particularly shocking when you remember that obligations to prevent genocide kick in when there's a serious risk of genocide, which I think the acts that you articulated earlier go to show a serious risk of genocide, or in the very least are part of that conversation. So my question to you is, do you think that there's a gendered component in why the genocide lens is not routinely being used to describe the situation in Tigray?
Thank you very much, Grant. Generally speaking, I think, of course, when we talk about Tigray, I think we can agree that there is ultimately not much attention on Tigray in general. So not only on the issue of rape and sexual violence and atrocities against women, but generally Tigray is not getting the attention it requires, in my opinion. But then again, rape and sexual violence also are not receiving enough attention, and whether in Tigray or other parts of the world. And I think what Sareta mentioned, it was very powerful as well. In the case of Yazidis, we have this understanding of the atrocities against women and girls, and of course the issue of sexual enslavement. But ultimately, why we, I do believe that the reason why we have this understanding of the atrocities, that is also because of the incredible work of the survivors of the atrocities, individuals such as Nadia Murad, who did not accept the general inaction on the topic as the final response. She's been going to the UN, to governments again and again to make sure that the issue is raised there. But ultimately, even now, 7 years later, there are still 2,763 women and children, Yazidi women and children, still missing. And we don't know what happened to them. Some of them may still be enslaved and have been living in sexual slavery for the last almost over 7 years. So, and there is again no international joint efforts to get them back. So I think it's very telling in terms of that, generally speaking, the issue of rape and sexual violence is not addressed in the way it should. And I think we are still not quite there in terms of fully recognizing that rape and sexual violence are often a method of war, let alone genocidal method. And rape and sexual violence remain underreported, under-discussed crimes, sometimes something which needs to change both within and outside of conflict scenarios. Our perception of rape and sexual violence in conflict has changed over time, of course. Rape and sexual violence used to be perceived as inevitable byproducts of war, the spoils of an invading army of successful conquerors. And now rape and sexual violence are recognized as a deliberate military strategy to demoralize the enemy. And this shift in recognition has been significant, especially that it has allowed for the prosecution of sexual violence in conflict. And of course, there have been also several UN documents in relation to that, including UN Security Council Resolution 1820 on the use of sexual violence in war, indicating that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute a war crime, a crime against humanity, or a constitutive act with response to genocide. And subsequent years have seen some action on the topic. However, none of the actions have been enough to provide a comprehensive response to the atrocities. And this, again, is a massive failure of the international community, states, UN, and so on. And indeed, rape and sexual violence continue to be practiced as a weapon of war. It's not an issue of the past only. And of course, today we've heard of the Daesh atrocities, the atrocities against the Rohingya Muslims, the atrocities in Tigray, and the atrocities against women in China. But this is only a few examples. Then, of course, we need to remember in Nigeria, Boko Haram is using rape and sexual violence against girls. And in Cameroon, again, the use of rape and sexual violence continues to this day as well. So unfortunately, we see those atrocities happening all over the world, and the response is neglectful. And it will continue to be a massive issue, and until a comprehensive legal framework exists that will actually address the atrocities. And this is also why I'm very much looking forward to see what is going to happen with the Red Line Initiative, which is the initiative introduced by Dr. Mukwege. And of course, Erin and Dr. Mukwege will be working on an international convention to address sexual violence in conflict. But again, even if we introduce new mechanisms, and hopefully we'll introduce mechanisms, if we look at the duty to prevent, and you mentioned it arises at the very moment a state learns or should have learned of this serious risk of genocide. If we were looking through the gendered lens, we should be able to spot the early warning signs of atrocities to come, and of course, address them. But there is yet another problem with the duty to prevent, and the problem is that not many states actually monitor early warning signs, analyze them, and make any kind of determinations whether atrocity crimes such as genocide are happening, or that there's indeed a serious risk of genocide. So we've had that, for example, the US makes such a determination. But even if we look what happened over the years, the US State Department made the formal determination of genocide in the case of Yazidis first in 2016, in March 2016. Of course, Obama mentioned that genocide was happening back in 2014, but it was not a formal determination. And of course, there have been some response, but not necessarily following through with all the responses from the US government there. But then 2014, that's when we know that the atrocities were more or less at its climax. Of course, the atrocities that happened were perpetrated on the 3rd of August. That was the climax of the atrocities, so to say. But the early warning signs were there for at least from 2013 and many months before we've seen the attack on Sinjar. And even before the attack on Sinjar also, the Iraqi government asked the UN for help, saying that we believe that genocide will happen. And again, there was no response until the attack on Sinjar. And the US is still one of not many governments that actually considers whether atrocities amount to genocide. And we've seen the response, of course, the determination in the case of the Yazidis, in the case of the Uyghurs. There still has been no response in relation to the atrocities against the Rohingya Muslims. Tigray is at least 2 years still away from any kind of consideration, I believe, because unfortunately we've seen such a long delay in responses to the atrocities, even with the very minimum of recognizing the atrocities for what they are. And then Erin mentioned that in the case of the Uyghur genocide, we've seen some determinations from governments, but actually the majority of determinations were from parliaments, not the governments. The US government is the only government that recognized the atrocities as genocide. The other recognitions were from parliaments. The same we've seen with the case of the Yazidis. We had 3 governments only that recognized the atrocities formally as genocide: US, Canada, and the Netherlands. And then several, I think over 14 or 15 determinations by parliaments. Governments are not doing enough to actually deal with the issue, and let alone recognize the atrocities for what they are. Parliamentarians have been definitely more proactive, but very often, even if the parliament recognizes, the government does not follow. That's certainly the case here in the UK. We had the House of Commons recognizing the atrocities against the Yazidis and against the Uyghurs as genocide. The government did not follow, arguing that it's for international judicial bodies to make such a determination. So unfortunately, I do have to say that states are not doing enough. They don't have mechanisms to actually to consider early warning signs. If they had such a mechanism, most likely they will also deal with the gender issue. But unfortunately, because they don't have this mechanism, there is zero analysis of the situations that would enable them to actually trigger the duty to prevent and act to address the atrocities. But this is my a bit of rambling about the problems with governments not recognizing the atrocities as genocide. And of course, I do believe that this is a massive, massive problem, that if states have had any kind of mechanism to monitor early warning signs, analyze them, make formal determinations, and then of course identify actions how to address those atrocities, I think we'll be in a very different situation than we are right now. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. And a very welcome commentary on the frustrations of the international community in response. I'm always here for beating up on governments. And you know, really, I think going on the back of things that Sarita and Erin touched on, you know, the erasure of gender and the fact that gender is intrinsic to the commission of genocide. I think that there's a lot that can be learned about what we take as indicators of genocide. And I would point out that in GJC's report, Beyond Killing, Sarita did an analysis of the existing risk factors that are set out by various instruments, and highlighting not only that they weren't nearly gender inclusive enough, but they, in many cases, reified and reinstituted gender stereotypes that are harmful. So that's in the prevention part of that report, and again, very important very important commentary from you on how governments have failed. I note that we're running a bit short on time. I had one last question for Razia that is exactly to this point on prevention and early warning signs. But we've only gotten a couple questions through the Q&A, and hopefully we'll have a bit more time after her comments. So I'd like to ask the audience, if you have anything, please put them in the Q&A section. And with that, don't want to rush you, Razia, but the final question I had is exactly on this situation of risk of genocide. So the Rohingya genocide is most commonly dated to the 2016-2017 operations in Rakhine State, but the risk of genocide against the Rohingya extends way, way, way before that. And in particular, Rohingya women were for years subject to discriminatory and dehumanizing birth control measures and human rights violations. And so I'm hoping you can shed light on, in that time before those operations, in what ways did the gendered treatment of the Rohingya women predict or indicate that the risk of genocide was present, that was ultimately, of course, came in 2016 and 2017.
Thank you. The Rohingya genocide maybe it's declared recently, but it's happened from beginning, from decade, because when I was young, I see so many things about, especially in the women issue, and we never see that anyone is analyze this issue. When the atrocity is taking place in 2017, because it's broke down and everything is open and people realize that something is happened, but it is not new. It's doing from decades. And we always try to expose this, and no one is listening, or if anyone listens, it is not genocide, or if we argue about this, not it is about time being issue, or it will be overcome. But Rohingya issue is never stopped, and it's ongoing. It's still ongoing, and it is not only the Rohingya issue inside the Myanmar. It is about the ethnic issue, especially what is up to in the women issue, because every time, every moment they're targeting, the vulnerable person who is the seen is the woman. And you recently you see in the after the coup, and they also targeting the woman, and they also kill innocent women. Yes, they are also men, but specifically they're targeting the woman. And for me, I don't have to explain, because this is a process where we always try to hide the real issue. And we are now in a one stage that because it cannot be hid. That's why maybe we say genocide, and myself I say genocide is okay, but when is that they attack the woman and they use the woman body as a weapon, the rape, the sexual harassment itself is genocide. Because every time I see when the sexual issue is addressed, they say this is not, they say everyone is included in genocide, the sexual harassment include in genocide element. But when I research this, I feel myself, the sexual harassment, the violence against women, it's not an element of genocide itself. This is itself a genocide. So we have to stop this. If we are quiet now, if we are not doing anything, and I think we have to see more, because in 20th century we see Yazidi, we see Uyghurs, or in China also. It is clear in our eyes that we cannot do anything, because we are not taking any action. We are not arguing about this issue. Even we are not pressuring our own government, because some government, I don't have to point the who are accountable for this and who are supporting or who are not supporting. But together, they are not doing anything. Just for peace, just we are creating events. We are just arguing. But what is our future plan? What can we do? Because when I am sitting here, I am now in event, and I know some sister in anywhere, they are face same thing, but we couldn't stop it. What can we do? We have to find a solution, and especially we women have to be involved in this issue, and together we have to find a solution. So no more, you don't have to use the woman body, and no more woman harassment, and women rights is also a human right. And without women's rights, we cannot value human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Razia. Again, just extremely poignant perspective, and yeah, I think really sheds light on the warning signs were there, and they were there for years and years and years in the international community. Touching on Evelina's point, it was either intentionally blind to them or didn't take action. So we have just 10 minutes left. Largely because as a moderator, I think I got far too drawn in and felt very much like an audience member. A couple of questions are trickling in, but I also want to make sure that our panelists have an opportunity for some closing remarks. But one thing that we haven't really touched on, Sarita, was this question that we referred to earlier, which asks, and really for anyone, I direct it to you because you had largely discussed the situation of the Yazidis, but the question was, can you please comment on the extent to which ISIS women, or what the question presents, the question called jihadi brides, how they participated in the trafficking and abuse of Yazidis in the Yazidi genocide. And she references Nadia Murad as begging for help from the women that households, or the women in the households of ISIS. And so, and potentially expanding that to, like we talked about, that gender doesn't just mean looking at women and girls as victims, and that there's a broader commentary here that I think is possible.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Thanks, Mia. I suppose the discussion of gender, I think, is part of a larger discussion of ensuring nuance in the conversation of genocide, how we understand genocide, how we understand those who perpetrate genocide. So just in pursuit of that nuance, and very quickly, because I am looking at the time, I'm going to just set out a little bit of the context. There has been an incredible focus and interest on female agency within ISIS. However, that is taking place within a space where there's actually very little concrete information about what that female agency was, what the role of women in ISIL was. So where we have a couple women come up, usually through prosecutions or through women who are seeking to be returned and have captured kind of the attention of the international community, such as Shamima Begum, for example, and the legal issues and social issues that surround them. That is really informing our understanding of women in ISIL, and it's not a good basis for doing so, in my view. So what we know about ISIL is an extremely patriarchal organization. There are no women on the military council, there are no women on the Shura council, there are no women on the Sharia council, there are no women heading any of its ministries or departments, there are no female battle commanders, and in the attack on Sinjar, we have never seen a statement, for example, of a female member of ISIL fighting or forming part of the group that attacked the Yazidis in the first place. That doesn't mean women have not been involved in crimes later on once women and children were taken deeper into the caliphate, but I think it frames our understanding that ISIL, the attack on the Yazidis, is something that was strategized and put into action and largely run, even with regard to the system of enslavement, by men, both from within the region and from quite far out of the region. Where we've seen women hold power, and I suppose there's only one issue of that, one example, for example, be Sayaf, who was the wife of the Minister of Oil, from, I think, late 2014 onwards. Abu Sayyaf was Minister of Oil, or maybe early 2015. With Sayyaf, we see another kind of truism that the power of women in the circumstance, in the context of ISIS, derives from the men that they are attached to. So this particular woman, her husband is a minister. He's very close to al-Baghdadi, then head of ISIL. She also comes from jihadi lineage. Her father was very linked in jihadis, but she herself didn't have that much power in the home. So when we speak about women being more brutal than men in Nadia Murad's book, I think it's important that what we are discussing is in the very small scale of where that takes place. Are women more brutal across the caliphate, across the architecture of the caliphate and crimes? No, because they are deliberately excluded from any attempts to from part of the power structure, because ISIS very firmly believes that is not the role of women. Do they have power in the houses in which they are living? Sometimes, yes. But, it's also important to know that, you have women who committed crimes in the homes, and such as beatings, potentially, beatings, mistreatment of women, bringing in the slaves, assisting their husbands, preparing their husbands, the women and girls who were sexually enslaved for being sexually assaulted and raped in the household, forced labor in the household. So you have women who committed crimes largely inside the homes, which was generally limited to the sphere of female influence, aside from the female morality police, of which I think if you were to believe most people, every woman was in the morality police. That was obviously not the case. You also have women who suffered violence in the homes from ISIL fighters, bearing in mind that, ISIL violence against women was in some ways part of its statecraft, that a lot of the wives of ISIL fighters are themselves Sunni women or victims of forced marriages and also violence within the home. One thing that has become clear in the literature that has seeped out into articles in The Guardian, for example, is that many of those who join these terrorist groups, one thing they have in common is a pre-existing history of violence against women in their home jurisdictions. And then you have some women who actually helped Yazidi women and men to escape, and children to escape, and provided them assistance, either nurses who were in the hospital, sometimes the relatives of the fighters, the wives, mothers of the fighters also assisted. So, the categories of women who committed crimes, women who themselves were victims of crimes by ISIL in various ways in the household, and women who helped, those are not separate categories of crimes. I think one of the things that we need to be very careful about is not employing black and white thinking and getting ahead of where the information evidence has led us, because there isn't a tremendous amount of information evidence against what Yazidi women did. I just want to end finally just to say that there has been this emphasis on women. We are seeing more women, for example, in the few cases being prosecuted in Germany. I think that's because women are more likely to survive. But there is certainly an element of a preoccupation with ISIL women or ISIL brides, if people want to say that, bearing in mind the prevalence of forced marriage makes that a little bit uncomfortable, is that perhaps they're crossing their own gender lines. Perhaps, our expectations of women are that they are less violent and more empathetic and more responsive to human suffering than men, and that therefore, our ability to allocate blame for them, to feel enraged by them, is really informed as well by our own gendered understanding, and also the pass that we are given to what is an extremely male, patriarchal, misogynist organization where men play the lead role. The level to which we're kind of bypassing discussion of male agency and focusing on female agency is something that is a little bit concerning and deserves more reflection.
Thank you, Sarita. I think a very fitting point to stop. This event looking generally at the ways that gender informs the commission, but also the response to genocide. But I think in your final points, also thinking about how we bring our own gender discriminations as experts, as international lawyers, as policy makers, as whoever, to this issue as well. So I had planned for final comments from the panelists, but like I said, I got too wrapped up as an audience member myself in the amazing things that our panelists are sharing. So I'm afraid I'm gonna have to forego that, but a very sincere and deeply felt thank you to the New Lines Institute and to our panelists for such incredible insights. It's really been a wonderful hour and a half. And with that, handing it back to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Grant, and to all of our panelists and speakers. It has been so interesting and such a pleasure listening to you all. This conversation on gendered analysis of contemporary genocides has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you everyone for your time. We will shortly be beginning the next panel on navigating state responses to genocide. So stay tuned. We will join back in about 1 minute.